The smell of open gear lube is something you never truly scrub out of your pores. It's a thick, asphalt-based black sludge that clings to everything: steel, denim, skin. Up here, inside the belly of Unit 4, the air always tasted like petroleum and ozone. I was 3 hours into a shift that was supposed to be routine, kneeling on the grated walkway of the swing deck, staring at the massive ring gear that allowed this 4,000-ton cathedral of steel to rotate. The grease gun in my hand hissed rhythmically, a pneumatic thwip hiss that injected molybdenum disulfide into the bearings. Unit 4 was a P&H 9020 dragline, a walking excavator the size of a decent office building, stranded in the lunar landscape of the Powder River Basin, Wyoming. To the uninitiated, it was just a machine. To those of us who kept it alive, it was a sovereign state. My job title said heavy maintenance technician, but out here, 40 miles from the nearest paved town, I was a vascular surgeon for a mechanical dinosaur. The floor beneath my boots vibrated with a frequency that rattled your teeth. That was the drag generators screaming under load. Somewhere 300 feet out on the boom, the bucket, big enough to park 2 F-150s inside, was tearing into the overburden, stripping the earth to get to the coal seam below.
The noise inside the housing was a physical weight. A constant 100-decibel roar of cooling fans, 60 hertz electrical hum, and the groaning of steel under tension. I finished the lube point, wiped my gloves on a rag that was already stiff with grease, and stood up. My knees popped. I checked the pressure gauges on the swing lube manifold. 3,000 psi. Good. I walked the catwalk toward the rear of the house, passing the rows of electrical cabinets that controlled the DC drive motors. The air here was warmer, heated by the massive banks of resistors and the sheer friction of the machinery. It was 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. I knew the time not by a watch, but by the rhythm of the haul trucks down in the pit. Usually I could see them through the dust gaps in the housing walls, yellow ants scurrying back and forth in a synchronized loop. I stepped into the tea room, a sound-dampened brake box welded into the corner of the machinery deck. I poured coffee from a thermos that had seen better decades. The radio on the wall, usually chattering with the banal insults of truck drivers and shovel operators, was making a sound I had not heard in 6 years on the job. It was not static. It was an open mic. Someone was keying the transmitter, holding the button down, and screaming. It was not a scream of pain. It was the high, thin, breathless shriek of someone watching something impossible happen. Then, a wet thud, and the transmission cut to a dead carrier hum. I frowned, tapping the handset. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4 Mechanical. You got a stuck mic on Channel 1. Clear it up." Silence. Not the empty silence of a quiet channel, but the heavy, pregnant silence of a room where everyone has stopped breathing. I stepped back out onto the machinery deck. The vibration in the floor changed. The drag motors spooled down. The hoist motors went idle. The massive drum brakes slammed shut with a report like a cannon shot. Clang, clang. The machine had tripped out. "Operator error," I muttered, clipping my radio to my chest harness. I headed for the stairs to the operator's cab, located on the front right corner of the housing, 3 stories up from the deck. The climb was narrow, steep, and slick with oil mist. When I pushed the door to the cab open, I expected to see Old Man Miller swearing at a fault code on the logic screen. The seat was empty. The door to the outside catwalk, the lanai we called it, was swinging open in the wind. I stepped into the cab. The controls were dead. The master switch was thrown, but the screens were black. That did not make sense. Even if the trailing cable, the thick umbilical cord that fed us 13,800 volts from the grid, had tripped, the emergency lighting should have kicked on.
I walked to the open door and looked down.
Unit 4 sat on the edge of the high wall, overlooking the pit floor 200 feet below. The scale of a surface mine messes with your depth perception. The haul trucks down there look like toys, but the tires are 12 feet tall. Usually, the pit floor is a ballet of yellow iron, dozers pushing, graders scraping, trucks hauling. Now the ballet had turned into a demolition derby. A haul truck, fully loaded with 300 tons of overburden, had driven straight off the haul road and T-boned a parked dozer. The impact had crumpled the dozer like a beer can. Smoke, black and oily, billowed from the wreck, but nobody was running toward it with fire extinguishers. I grabbed my binoculars from the dash. I adjusted the focus, fighting the slight sway of the dragline in the wind. The drivers were not in their cabs. They were on the ground. A cluster of figures in high-vis vests was swarming around a pickup truck near the ramp. It looked like a fight, a brawl. Arms flailing, bodies tackling each other into the coal dust. Then I saw one figure, a guy in a blue mechanic's coverall, sprint away from the group. He was fast, impossibly fast for a guy in steel toes. He scrambled up the side of the haul truck's wheel well, slipping, clawing, frantic. 3 others broke from the pack and chased him. They did not run like people. They ran like dogs, low and lunging. They caught him at the top of the ladder. There was no hesitation, no negotiation. They just tore him down. I lowered the binoculars. The wind up here, 50 feet above the ground level, cut through my jacket. It was late October in Wyoming. The air smelled of snow and pulverized rock. Then the lights went out. Not the lights on the machine, those were already dead. The lights on the horizon. The sodium vapor glow of the prep plant 5 miles away blinked out. The red blinking lights on the wind turbines on the ridgeline ceased. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise had been. The hum of the transformers died. The fans spun down. The dragline was not just stopped. It was a corpse. The grid had gone down hard. A hard trip that meant a substation had blown or a line had been severed physically. I looked back down at the pit. The figures were spreading out. The ants were scattering. I needed to get down. My truck was parked at the base of the machine near the boarding ladder. I could drive out. I could hit the county road, head toward Gillette, find my brother. I turned to leave the cab, my hand reaching for the doorframe. Then I stopped. Down on the access ramp, a white company pickup came careening down the slope, drifting sideways in the gravel. It smashed through the safety berm and launched itself into the pit, rolling over 3 times before coming to rest on its roof. A moment later, the driver crawled out. He stood up, swaying. From the shadows of the high wall, a dozen shapes emerged. They were not miners. They were wrong. They moved with a twitchy, spasmodic gait. They converged on the driver. He did not even have time to scream before he disappeared under a pile of frantic limbs. I looked at the road out. It was a choke point, a single gravel artery leading out of a hole in the earth, and it was filling up with stopped cars and running figures. I looked at the dragline. She was 4,000 tons of hardened steel. The operator's cab was 50 feet off the ground. The machinery house was a fortress of plate metal designed to withstand falling rock and blizzard winds. The only way in was the boarding ladder, a retractable gangway that hung from the belly of the machine. If I went down there, I was meat. A guy with a wrench in a field of monsters. If I stayed here, I looked at the dashboard. My lunchbox was there, a gallon of water. In the machinery house, there were lockers, rags, chemicals, tools. Physics, I whispered to myself. It was the only thing I trusted. Biology was failing, society was failing. But steel was steel. Gravity was gravity. The decision did not feel like courage. It felt like a calculation, a risk assessment. I was not leaving. I clipped the radio back to my chest and moved. Fast. The first priority was the shoe. The dragline does not have tracks. It sits on a massive circular tub, 60 feet in diameter.
When it walks, it uses two giant shoes, pontoons really, that lift the whole machine, drag it backward, and set it down. Right now, the shoes were up. The machine was sitting flat on its tub. The boarding ladder lowered from the belly of the revolving frame down to the ground. It was hydraulic. With the power out, the hydraulic pumps were dead. But hydraulic systems bleed. Seals weep. Over time, gravity pulls everything down. If that ladder drifted down, it was a welcome mat for everything down in the pit. I scrambled down the internal stairwell, my boots ringing on the diamond plate. The interior was getting dark fast. The only light came from the dust gaps, narrow ventilation slits in the walls. I clicked on my headlamp. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating the massive drum of the hoist cable. I reached the lower deck. The boarding ladder access was an open hatch in the floor with a railing. I looked down through the grating. The ladder was currently up, in the stowed position, but I could hear the faint hiss of the pilot check valves. The pressure was equalizing. It was already sagging a few inches. I needed to lock it, mechanically. I ran to the rigging locker on the far wall. This was where we kept the heavy gear for changing cables, chains, shackles, snatch blocks. I grabbed a 20-foot length of grade 80 alloy chain, heavy enough to tow a semi-truck, and a ratchet load binder. The chain weighed about 50 pounds. I threw it over my shoulder, the cold steel biting into my neck through the collar of my jacket. I grabbed the binder and a cheater pipe. I went back to the hatch. I had to climb down onto the ladder structure itself to secure it. This was a violation of about 10 distinct safety protocols. MSHA, Mine Safety and Health Administration, would have written me a citation that cost more than my house. Screw MSHA, I grunted. I climbed over the railing and lowered myself onto the aluminum steps of the gangway. I was hanging under the belly of the machine now. Below me, 20 feet of empty air, then the rocky ground of the bench. The wind was vicious down here, funneling under the massive chassis. It swung the ladder slightly. I looked at the ground. My pickup truck was parked right there. I could see my travel mug sitting on the dashboard. It looked like it belonged to a different life. A movement caught my eye. Near the tracks of the dozer I had seen earlier, a figure was walking. It was not running. It was shambling. It wore a torn, reflective vest. It stopped, lifted its head, and looked up at the machine. It did not see me. It saw the movement of the ladder swaying. I wrapped the chain around the structural beam of the ladder, box tubing steel, 4 inches thick. Then I threw the other end over the main truss of the revolving frame above me. It was an awkward throw. The heavy links clattered against the steel, ringing like a dinner bell. The figure below snapped its head toward the sound. It started moving toward the machine. Then it broke into a run. Damn it, I hissed. I hooked the chain back onto itself, creating a loop. I hooked the ratchet binder into the links. I needed to pull the ladder up, tight against the bumpers, so it could not drift down even an inch. The figure reached the area below the ladder. It jumped. It was a vertical leap that should not have been possible. The thing, it was a man, or it had been, with a crushed jaw and gray skin, clawed at the air. Its fingers brushed the bottom rung of the ladder, 10 feet below my boots. I started cranking the binder. Click, clack. Click, clack. The slack came out of the chain. The ladder groaned and lifted slightly, metal grinding on metal. The thing below jumped again. It screamed, a sound like tearing metal. It slammed into the massive steel tub of the dragline, rebounded, and scrambled up the side of the tub base. It could not climb the tub. The steel was smooth, painted, and vertical for 8 feet. But it was trying. It was scratching the paint, breaking its fingernails, leaving bloody streaks on the majestic yellow steel of Unit 4. I cranked the binder harder. The chain went bar tight. I grabbed the cheater pipe, a 2-foot length of steel pipe, slid it over the handle of the binder, and pulled with everything I had. Crack! The binder cammed over and locked. The ladder was fused to the frame. It was not going anywhere. Even if the hydraulics failed completely, the chain would hold the weight. I climbed back up through the hatch, my chest heaving. I slammed the steel grate shut. Then I dropped the heavy steel trapdoor over it and spun the locking wheel. I sat on the cold steel floor, my back against a hydraulic reservoir, and listened. Below me, muffled by inches of steel plate, I could hear the thing scratching. It knew I was up here. It could smell me, or hear me, or maybe it just hated the machine. I checked my pockets. A folding knife, Kershaw, serrated, a multi-tool, a lighter, a pack of gum, a roll of electrical tape. Phase 1, I whispered. Secure the perimeter. I stood up. The silence of the machine was creeping into my bones. A dragline is never silent. It's always breathing. Fans, pumps, compressors. Without that noise, the space felt dead. And cold. The temperature outside was dropping. It was probably 20 degrees Fahrenheit. By tonight, it would be 10. Inside the uninsulated steel housing, it would be exactly the same temperature as outside within 3 hours. I needed to do a full perimeter check. There were other ways in, if you were crazy or determined. I walked the length of the machinery house. It was 200 feet long. I checked the rear doors, heavy steel personnel doors used for accessing the radiators.
Locked. I checked the maintenance hatches in the floor. Bolted down. Then I reached the boom foot pins. The boom of the dragline projected out from the front of the house. It was a lattice structure, 300 feet long. The fair lead, the massive swivel structure where the drag ropes entered the house, was open to the air. It had to be, to let the ropes move. The opening was huge. You could drive a Volkswagen through the fair lead gap. I shined my light out there. The drag ropes, steel cables as thick as my wrist, hung slack, disappearing into the dark toward the bucket. Could something climb the boom? Maybe. It was a lattice. It was essentially a 300-foot ladder. If they could get to the bucket, or if the bucket was on the ground. I tried to remember where the operator had left the bucket. I ran back to the cab. I looked out the window. The bucket was resting on the bench, the level ground where the dragline sat, about 50 feet in front of the machine. That was a problem. If those things could climb the lattice work of the bucket, they could walk up the drag ropes like a tightrope, or crawl up the boom structure itself. I needed to block the fair lead. I ran back to the rigging locker. I grabbed every ratchet strap I could find, 2-inch straps, heavy-duty trucking straps. The fair lead opening was guarded by a safety cage, but the mesh was wide. A person could squeeze through. I spent the next hour weaving a web.
I took the ratchet straps and crisscrossed them over the opening, tightening them until they sang. It was not a wall, but it was a net. Anything trying to crawl through would get tangled. Then I reinforced it with whatever I could find. Pallets. I found a stack of wooden pallets near the lube drums, I dragged them over and wedged them between the straps and the steel frame, creating a makeshift barricade. My hands were numb. The wind whistling through the fairlead was biting. I could not feel my fingertips. I stepped back to admire my work. It looked like trash, a shanty town wall of wood and yellow webbing. But it held when I kicked it. I checked the time on the dead control panel. The sun was setting. The light inside the house was fading to a deep, bruising purple. I needed a keep, a safe zone. The machinery house was too big, too cold, and too full of shadows. The operator's cab was the obvious choice. It was small. It had windows, which was both good and bad. It was elevated, but it was glass. If they started throwing rocks, or if they had guns. No. The electrical control room, ECR. Inside the main house, there was a separate enclosed room that housed the PLCs and low-voltage electronics. It was insulated to keep the computers happy. It had a heavy steel door with a seal. It was in the center of the machine, protected by layers of steel on all sides. I moved my gear there. My lunchbox, the water.
I raided the other lockers. I found a stash of rags, a few rolls of shop towels, a first aid kit, mostly Band-Aids and eye wash, and, crucially, a flashlight with spare D-cell batteries. I also found the Safety Awards stash in the foreman's desk, a box of cheap, branded winter beanies and a few pairs of insulated leather gloves. Gold. I put on a beanie and a fresh pair of gloves. I sat in the dark of the ECR. The room was pressurized, so it was silent. I could not hear the wind anymore. I cracked a glow stick I found in the emergency kit and set it on the floor. The eerie green light illuminated the rows of silent server racks. I was hungry, but I did not eat. I took a sip of water. I thought about the guy I saw getting torn down. I thought about the white truck rolling into the pit. Orson, I said aloud, using my name just to hear a human voice. You are in a P&H 9020. You are 40 feet in the air. You have 1,000 gallons of grease and enough tools to disassemble the world. I laid my head on a stack of shop towels. The drag line shifted. Just a millimeter. The steel contracting as it cooled in the night air. The sound was a deep, resonant groan that traveled through the floor and into my spine. It sounded like the machine was lonely. I closed my eyes, but I did not sleep. I listened to the wind buffering the outer walls, and I visualized the boarding ladder, the chain, the binder, the tension. I mentally traced every bolt, every weld, every potential failure point. When the screaming started outside, distant, echoing off the canyon walls of the mine pit, I did not look out the window. I just tightened my grip on the heavy wrench I had placed beside me and waited for the sun to rise on a dead world. The cold did not wake me up. The silence did. When you spend a decade working in heavy industry, your brain tunes itself to a baseline of vibration. A running drag line is a symphony of 60 hertz hum, the whine of cooling fans, and the rhythmic thump hiss of hydraulic valves. Silence means a trip. Silence means a fault. Silence usually means you're about to get yelled at by a foreman. Now, silence meant the world had stopped turning. I opened my eyes. My breath plumed in the air, a thick, gray cloud that hung stagnant in the electrical control room. The thermometer on the wall, a cheap plastic dial given out by a bearing vendor, read 18 degrees Fahrenheit. The steel floor sucked the heat out of my hip through the layers of cardboard I'd laid down. I sat up, my joints popping like dry twigs. The first rule of hypothermia is that it makes you stupid.
it makes you slow. I forced myself to go through a mental diagnostic. Fingers? Stiff but moving. Toes? Numb. Mental state? Foggy. I stood up and walked to the door of the ECR. I did not open it yet. I listened. Wind.
Just the wind, whistling through the corrugated steel siding of the machinery house, playing the massive structure like a broken flute. No screaming. No scratching. I cracked the seal on the heavy steel door. The air inside the main machinery house was even colder than the control room. It smelled of ozone, old grease, and the distinct metallic tang of freezing iron. I needed 3 things to survive the week: water, heat, power. And I needed them in that order, or the physics of this place would kill me long before the biology down in the pit did. I walked to the dust gap on the starboard wall, a louvered vent about shoulder height. I peered down. The sun was up, casting long, sharp shadows across the mine. The pit floor was white. Snow had fallen overnight, a dusting of maybe 2 inches that hid the coal dust and the blood. Below, near the tracks, I saw shapes. Dark lumps in the snow. Some were motionless. Others were pacing. They moved in tight, agitated circles, like wolves in a cage. They had not left. They were waiting. My gallon of water sat on the desk. It was slushy. I took a sip, swirling the ice crystals in my mouth to melt them before swallowing. That gallon was a timer. When it hit empty, I was on a clock that ended in dehydration and delirium. But first, heat. If I did not raise the ambient temperature in the ECR, I would not be able to think clearly enough to solve the water problem. I could not build a wood fire. Smoke in a confined space is suicide, and wood is scarce inside a steel machine. I needed a fuel source that was dense, abundant, and burnable. I looked at the 55-gallon drums lining the wall of the lube bay. Hydraulic fluid, gear oil, open gear lube. The P&H 9020 holds thousands of gallons of petroleum products. It was a bomb sitting on a tub. But burning oil is not like burning wood. You cannot just light a puddle of 90-weight gear oil with a match. It has a high flash point. It needs to be vaporized or wicked. I needed a waste oil stove. And I had to build it with hand tools because my angle grinder was a paperweight without 110-volt power. I started the scavenge. I moved through the silent cathedral of the machinery deck, my boots stepping carefully on the diamond plate. I felt like a tomb raider in my own office. I found my primary vessel in the rag bin, a 5-gallon metal safety can, the kind with the spring-loaded lid used for storing solvent rags. It was heavy-gauge steel, painted red. Perfect. Next, I needed a flue. A stove without a chimney is just a carbon monoxide generator. I raided the auxiliary generator room. The small diesel generator, used for lighting during maintenance, now dry and dead, had a flexible steel exhaust pipe, about 3 inches in diameter. I disconnected it from the manifold using a crescent wrench, fighting rusted bolts that screeched in the quiet. I managed to pull about 6 feet of flex pipe. Now came the hard part: fabrication without electricity. I carried my materials back to the workshop area, a steel workbench welded to the frame near the rear of the house. I clamped the safety can into the vise. The plan was a gravity-fed drip burner. It's a design as old as the Depression. You drip oil onto a hot plate inside a chamber. The heat vaporizes the oil, and the vapor burns. It's dirty, it's hot, and if you mess it up, it can run away on you and melt your stove. I started with the air intake. A fire needs oxygen.
Using a heavy ball-peen hammer and a cold chisel, I began to punch holes around the base of the can. Clang, clang, clang. The sound was deafening. I paused after every strike, listening for a reaction from below. The wind swallowed the noise. I hoped. I cut a rectangular door near the bottom using a hacksaw. This was brutal, shoulder-burning work. The hacksaw blade was dull, and the steel of the safety can was thicker than I expected. I sawed rhythmically, counting the strokes to keep my mind focused. 1, 2, 3, 4. Switch hands. 1, 2, 3, 4. My breath fogged my safety glasses. My knuckles ached. After 40 minutes of sawing, I had a rough, jagged little door that I could pry open with pliers. This would be for lighting the pilot and cleaning out the soot. Next, the flue.
I used the chisel to punch a circle of holes in the lid of the can, then knocked out the center plug. I shoved the flex pipe into the hole. It was a loose fit. Smoke follows the path of least resistance, and a loose gap meant death. I needed a gasket. I found a sheet of high-temperature exhaust packing in the gasket drawer, a fibrous silver material used for diesel manifolds. I cut a ring, wrapped it around the pipe, and jammed it into the hole. Then I used self-tapping screws, driving them in by hand with a nut driver to secure the pipe to the lid. It was not pretty. It looked like a medieval torture device, bristling with screw heads and jagged metal. But it was tight. The feed system was the pièce de résistance. I walked to the pneumatic control panel. This machine used compressed air to actuate the clutches and brakes. The airlines were 1/4-inch copper and plastic tubing. I scavenged a 10-foot length of copper line and, crucially, a brass needle valve used for flow control. I drilled a hole, using a hand brace and a dull bit I found in the bottom of a drawer in the side of the safety can, about halfway up. I threaded the copper line through, bending it so it pointed down toward the bottom of the can. I mounted the needle valve on the other end of the copper line. Above that, I rigged a funnel made from a cut-off plastic water bottle. The hearth inside the can needed to be something that could hold heat. I found a handful of old, rusted bolts and a broken bearing race in the scrap bin. I tossed them into the bottom of the can. They would act as the thermal mass. Once they got hot, the oil dripping onto them would flash into vapor instantly. Now for the installation. I carried the contraption into the ECR. I could not vent it through the roof. Cutting through the 1/4-inch plate ceiling was impossible by hand. I had to go out the wall. The ECR had a cable pass through, a Roxtec block where the data cables entered the room. It was a rubber modular seal. I disassembled it, pulling out the rubber blocks until I had a hole big enough for the flex pipe. I pushed the exhaust pipe through the wall, angling it down slightly so condensation would not run back into the stove. Outside, the pipe stuck out about a foot into the main machinery house. That was not ideal. I was venting exhaust into the outer house, but the outer house was huge and drafty. It would dissipate. The priority was keeping the control room air clean. I secured the stove to the floor using a coil of tie wire, lashing it to the leg of the heavy steel desk. If the machine moved or vibrated, I did not want a bucket of burning oil tipping over onto my lap. Fuel. I took a clean coffee can and walked to the hydraulic reservoir. The sight glass showed it was full. I opened the sample petcock and filled the can with ISO 32 hydraulic fluid. It was amber, viscous, and smelled like money. I returned to the ECR. I poured the oil into the funnel. I opened the needle valve. Drip, drip, drip. The oil fell from the copper tube, landing on the pile of bolts in the bottom of the can. I tore off a strip of cotton rag, soaked it in lighter fluid from my pocket, lit it, and dropped it in through the bottom door. The rag flared up.
The flame licked at the bolts. I watched, holding my breath. For a minute, it was just a burning rag. Then the bolts started to heat up. The oil dripping onto them hissed. Ch, ch. Then a low, throaty woof. The oil vapor caught. The flame changed from a lazy yellow to a jagged, aggressive orange. A draft established itself in the flue, pulling air in through the bottom holes with a soft whistle. I closed the little door I'd cut, leaving it cracked just an inch for airflow. The stove began to purr. It was a dirty, industrial sound, like a cat with emphysema. But it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. I held my hands out. Radiant heat. It punched through the cold air, stinging my frozen fingertips. I watched the paint on the safety can blister and peel, the steel turning a dull, angry gray. I adjusted the needle valve. Drip, drip, drip. Faster. The roar increased. The flex pipe turned a faint purple near the lid. I sat back, leaning against the server rack. The temperature in the room would not rise fast, but the immediate vicinity of the stove was a tropical island.
Step 1 complete. Now, water. I had heat, which meant I could melt snow, but getting snow inside was a tactical problem. The ECR was in the middle of the house. To get snow, I had to go outside. I walked to the starboard door of the machinery house. It opened onto a narrow catwalk with a handrail, 50 feet above the ground. I cracked the door. The wind hit me like a physical blow, carrying snowflakes that felt like sand. I did not want to step out. The catwalk was grated steel. If I slipped, or if something was waiting on the roof, I needed a dredge. I went back to the workshop. I found a plastic 5-gallon bucket. I tied a length of paracord to the handle. I added a heavy shackle to the bale to give it weight so it would not just blow around in the wind. I returned to the door. I opened it, leaned out, and looked up. The roof of the machinery house was flat with a slight pitch. It was covered in about 4 inches of fresh powder. I swung the bucket like a pendulum, gathering momentum, and tossed it upward. It clattered onto the roof. I pulled the rope. The bucket dragged through the snow, scooping up a load. I hauled it down. It snagged on the gutter. I yanked. It broke free, dumping half the snow on my head, but I caught the bucket before it hit the catwalk. I pulled it inside and slammed the door, locking the deadbolt. I carried the bucket of snow into the ECR. I did not have a pot. I had a stove made of a solvent can, but the top was cluttered with the exhaust pipe. I could not cook on top of it. I had to put the snow against the stove. I found a clean metal dustpan in the corner. I scrubbed it with a rag and some hand sanitizer. I scooped snow into the dustpan and propped it up so it leaned against the hot steel body of the stove. It was slow. Agonizingly slow. The snow slumped, turned to slush, and then a trickle of water ran down the corner of the dustpan. I positioned my coffee cup underneath. Drip, drip, drip. It would take hours to get a gallon. But it was working. I sat there, feeding the oil drip, watching the snow melt. The air in the room was getting hazy. The stove was not airtight. It leaked a little acrid smoke. But it was warm. The thermometer had climbed to 35 degrees. I took off my gloves. My hands were stained black with grease and soot. I looked at the server racks. The blinking lights were all dead. The silence was still there, underneath the roar of my homemade furnace. I needed to check the batteries. The dragline had a UPS, uninterruptible power supply for the onboard computer system. It lived in the bottom of the electrical cabinet.
I used a flathead screwdriver to pop the panel latch. Inside, there were 4 heavy 12-volt AGM batteries, wired in series for 48 volts. The display on the UPS was dark.
The batteries were likely drained, or the system had shut down to protect them. I pulled my multimeter from my tool vest. I tested the bank. 11.2 volts across the first battery, 10.8 on the second. They were deeply discharged, but not dead. I disconnected the series jumpers. I isolated the healthiest battery, the one reading 11.2 volts. I did not have a 12-volt light bulb. The dragline lighting was all 110-volt AC or 24-volt DC emergency lighting. I rummaged through my tool bag and found my spare headlamp. It ran on 3 AAA batteries. I popped the case open. I could hardwire it, but the voltage would fry the LED. Then I remembered the operator's cab. The radio. The CB radio ran on 12 volts, and the dashboard had an old-school cigarette lighter port. I scavenged a length of 14-gauge wire from a spool in the cabinet. I ran a line from the battery terminals. I stripped the ends of the wire. I touched them to the contacts of a 24-volt emergency light fixture I'd pulled from the wall earlier. The bulb glowed. It was dim. Running a 24-volt bulb on 11 volts is inefficient, but it was light. A soft, warm, steady light that did not require batteries. I taped the wires to the bulb terminals. I hung the light from the ceiling rack. The room changed. It was not just a dark box with a fire anymore. It was a workshop. I sat back on my cardboard bed. I had a stove roaring, melting snow into a dustpan. I had a dim electric light pushing back the shadows. I felt a strange, grim satisfaction. This was the competence porn I lived for, usually. Fixing the unfixable. But usually, at the end of the shift, I went home to a warm shower and a cold beer. I looked at the cup of water. It was about half full. I took a sip. It tasted of metal and roof grit, with a subtle aftertaste of coal dust. "Vintage," I whispered. Then the sound came. It was not the wind. It was a metallic clank from the boarding ladder. I froze. My hand went to the heavy pipe wrench I had laid next to my sleeping spot. The ladder was chained up. I had ratcheted it tight. Clank. Something heavy was hitting the chain, or testing it. I stood up, moving silently to the ECR door. I turned off my jerry-rigged light. I walked into the darkness of the machinery house, navigating by memory. I reached the hatch in the floor, the one I had bolted shut. I knelt down, pressing my ear against the cold steel of the trapdoor. The sound was distinct now. It was the sound of the ladder swaying and hitting the bumpers. Someone, or something, was hanging on it. I heard a voice. Not a moan, not a scream. "Hello?" It was a woman's voice, hoarse, terrified. "Is anyone up there? I saw the smoke." I gripped the wrench. A survivor, or bait. I did not answer immediately. I thought about the physics. The ladder was retracted. To be on it, she had to have climbed the structure from the ground or piled something up to reach the bottom rung.
"Please," the voice cracked. "They're coming back." I closed my eyes. The calculation ran in my head. Opening the hatch meant breaking the seal. It meant noise. It meant exposure. But if she was alone... "Name?" I said through the steel floor. My voice sounded rusty. "Sarah," she gasped. "My name is Sarah. I'm a haul truck driver. Truck 402. I knew Truck 402. It was the one I'd seen T-bone the dozer. "Are you bit?" I asked. A pause. "No. Bruised. Broken ribs, maybe, but not bit." I hesitated. The isolation was safe. People were variables. Variables broke systems. But I was a mechanic. I fixed broken things. "Stand clear of the swing path," I said. "I'm unlocking the hatch." I spun the wheel on the trapdoor. The dogs disengaged with a heavy thunk. I lifted the heavy steel plate. The cold air rushed up from the gap. I looked down through the grating. She was clinging to the aluminum gangway, 20 feet below the floor of the house, swaying in the void. Her face was a mask of coal dust and blood, illuminated by the faint reflection of the snow below. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and white in the darkness. "Do not drop me," she whispered. "I do not drop things," I said. "Climb." Gravity is a constant, but weight is a variable that changes with leverage.
Hauling 140 pounds of dead weight up a vertical shaft is not something you do with your biceps. Not unless you want to blow a disc before the apocalypse is 3 days old. It's a geometry problem. "Stay still," I barked down the hatch. The wind stole half the volume of my voice, swirling it into the vortex beneath the revolving frame. Sarah was clinging to the aluminum rails of the boarding ladder, her knuckles white even through the grime. She was shivering violently, the kind of gross motor tremors that say the body is dumping adrenaline and core heat simultaneously. I did not reach for her hand. That's how people fall. I reached for the 1-ton lever hoist I'd grabbed from the rigging locker on my sprink back. It was a heavy, rusted orange unit, the chain coated in tacky grease. I hooked the top hook onto the overhead beam of the machinery house roof, directly above the hatch. I spooled out the load chain, the steel links rattling like bones. "Catch," I said, and dropped the hook down the hole. It swung near her head. She flinched, nearly losing her grip. "Hook it to your belt," I ordered. "If you do not have a belt, put the hook through the armhole of your vest and loop it back on itself. Do not put it around your neck." She fumbled with it, her fingers clumsy with cold. She managed to snag the back of her heavy Carhartt jacket and the webbing of her safety vest. It was not an OSHA-approved harness, but it would hold long enough to get her over the lip. I grabbed the lever handle. It was cold enough to burn my palm through the glove. I switched the pawl to up and cranked. Click, crack, click, crack. The ratchet mechanism screamed in the quiet house. With every pull, the chain tightened. Sarah gasped as the slack came out and the hook bit into her jacket, lifting her weight off her feet. "Keep your legs straight," I grunted, putting my back into the lever. "Walk up the ladder as I pull." She scrambled, her boots slipping on the frosted aluminum. I pumped the handle, a rhythmic, brutal motion. Heave, click, heave, click. She rose out of the gloom like a diver surfacing from black water. First the hood of her jacket, then her shoulders. When her waist cleared the hatch combing, I dropped the lever, grabbed the back of her coat with both hands, and dragged her onto the diamond plate floor. She collapsed in a heap, coughing dry, hacking sounds. I did not comfort her. I spun around and kicked the hatch shut, spinning the locking wheel until it seated with a definitive metallic thud. Then I listened. Below us, the wind howled through the undercarriage. But underneath the wind, there was a sound that did not belong to the weather. A wet, rhythmic slapping against the steel tub. They were down there, and they knew we were up here. "Do not move," I said. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it on her. She flinched away from the beam. "I need to check you," I said, my voice flat. "Bites, scratches. If you're breached, you go back down." It was cruel, but cruelty is just efficiency when the margin of error is zero. She unzipped her jacket with shaking hands. "I told you, I'm clean." She was not clean. She was covered in coal dust, grease, and dried blood that was not hers. But as I scanned her arms, her neck, her torso, I did not see the telltale darkened veins or the ragged tears of a bite. What I did see was the way she held her left side. Her ribcage hitched every time she inhaled. "Ribs?" I asked. "Steering wheel," she wheezed. "When I hit the berm." "Walk," I said. "We're going to the ECR. It's warm." The walk through the machinery house was a journey through a freezer. The massive steel components, the hoist drum, the swing transmissions, radiated cold. We reached the electrical control room, and I shoved the heavy door open. The heat hit us. It was not tropical, but compared to the 30 degrees outside, 50 degrees felt like a sauna. The smell was intense, burning hydraulic oil, hot steel, and unwashed bodies. Sarah slumped against the server rack, sliding down to the floor. She stared at my jerry-rigged waste oil stove, the flame flickering behind the intake holes. "You built this?" she asked. "Physics," I said. "Strip the wet layers. Hypothermia kills faster than ribs." I turned my back to give her privacy, focusing on the stove. The drip rate was too high. The flame was getting erratic, puffing black smoke every few seconds. I tweaked the needle valve, slowing the flow. "I have water," I said, pointing to the dustpan melting system. "Ration it." She did not answer. I turned around. She had passed out, her head lolling on her shoulder. Crisis number 1. Medical. I did not have a trauma kit. I had a heavy industry first aid box meant for cut fingers and dust in the eyes. I dug through my tool bag and found a roll of duct tape and a clean shop towel. I gently felt her side. She groaned in her sleep. Broken, maybe. Definitely bruised. Without an X-ray, the treatment was the same. Immobilization. I did not wrap her chest tight. That causes pneumonia. I folded the shop towel into a thick pad, placed it over the injury site, and taped it down to stabilize the skin and muscle. It was crude, but it would stop the sharpest pain. I sat back on my cardboard mat, watching the temperature gauge. The wind outside was picking up. The corrugated walls of the machinery house were vibrating, a low-frequency hum that set my teeth on edge. That was when the stove coughed. A puff of acrid black smoke shot out of the intake holes. The flame turned from a healthy orange to a lazy, sooty yellow. Backdraft. The wind direction had shifted. It was blowing straight down the exhaust pipe I'd stuck through the wall. Instead of drawing smoke out, the high pressure outside was pushing exhaust back into the room. I stood up. The air in the ECR was already getting hazy. Carbon monoxide is odorless, but unburnt hydraulic vapor smells like death. "Damn it," I hissed. I could not just turn it off. If I killed the flame, the room would freeze in 2 hours. And Sarah, in her condition, would not survive a deep freeze. I had to fix the flue. From the outside. In a blizzard. I grabbed my face mask, a half-face respirator with P100 filters I used for welding. I strapped it on. I put my beanie back on, pulled my hood up, and grabbed the roll of duct tape and a pair of tin snips from the workbench. I looked at Sarah. She was breathing shallowly. "Do not die while I'm gone," I muttered. I stepped out of the ECR, sealing the door behind me to keep the heat in. The main house was freezing. I walked to the starboard door, the one leading to the catwalk where the pipe exited. I put my hand on the latch. The metal was so cold it felt sticky. I shoved the door open.
The violence of the weather was shocking. The wind hit me with the force of a physical shove, nearly knocking me back into the house. Snow, hard and granular like salt, scoured my exposed skin. I stepped onto the catwalk. It was slick with ice. I clipped my safety lanyard to the handrail.
It was a reflex, muscle memory from 1,000 shifts, and it probably saved my life. I shuffled along the grating, keeping my center of gravity low. The world was a white void. I could not see the ground. I could not see the pit. I could barely see the handrail 2 feet in front of me. I reached the spot where the flex pipe poked through the wall. It was bad. The wind was hammering directly against the side of the machine, forcing air down the throat of the pipe. I needed to build a wind cap, a directional shield. I had a piece of sheet metal I'd grabbed from the scrap bin, an old license plate I'd found in the cab. I pulled the tin snips from my pocket. My fingers were already numb. I cut the plate in half, bending it into a curve. I needed to screw it onto the end of the pipe, creating a hood that faced down and away from the wind. I was fumbling with a self-tapping screw, pressing the drill driver against the pipe, when the catwalk vibrated. It was not the wind. I paused, pressing my gloved hand against the steel grating. Thump, thump, thump. Something was walking on the roof. The machinery house roof is flat, designed for maintenance access, but there's no ladder from the ground to the roof. You have to climb the boom or the gantry. I looked up. The edge of the roof was 3 feet above my head. A face appeared over the gutter. It was gray, frozen, and slack. The eyes were clouded with cataracts of ice. It was wearing a tattered windbreaker that fluttered in the gale. A sprinter. It must have climbed the pendants, the support cables holding up the boom, and crawled along the gantry. It saw me. It did not scream. It just launched itself. It came over the edge of the roof in a fluid, boneless motion, dropping onto the narrow catwalk. I was trapped. Behind me, the locked door. In front of me, the creature. To my right, the wall. To my left, a 50-foot drop into the darkness. It lunged. I swung the drill driver. It was a heavy 18-volt Milwaukee, a solid brick of plastic and metal. I connected with its temple. Crack! The plastic casing of the battery shattered. The creature's head snapped back, but it did not fall. It grabbed my jacket with fingers that felt like steel clamps. The strength was unnatural. It was not fighting with technique. It was fighting with total, hysterical muscular contraction. We slammed into the handrail. The old steel groaned. I dropped the drill. I grabbed the creature's wrists, trying to break its grip. It snapped its jaws at my face, its teeth clicking together inches from my nose. The smell coming off it was worse than the hydraulic fluid. It smelled like copper and rotted meat frozen in time. I could not overpower it. It did not feel pain. It did not care about the cold. Physics, I grunted through clenched teeth. I went limp. I dropped my weight, bending my knees. The creature, pushing forward with all its momentum, stumbled over me. I drove my shoulder into its midsection and pushed, not away, but up and over. It hit the handrail at the waist. The center of gravity shifted. For a second, it teetered there, flailing at the snow. I grabbed its legs and heaved. It went over. There was no scream, just the sound of wind. And then, a second later, a dull thud somewhere far below. I slumped against the wall, gasping for air. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I checked my arms. The heavy canvas of my jacket held. No bites. I picked up the drill,
The battery housing was cracked, held together by tape, but the motor still spun. The pipe. I forced my hands to stop shaking. I placed the curved piece of license plate over the end of the pipe. I drove 3 screws into it, shielding the opening from the wind. Immediately, the smoke pouring out of the pipe smoothed out. The back pressure was gone. I did not linger to admire the work. I unclipped my lanyard and scrambled back to the door. Inside the machinery house, the silence felt heavy. I locked the door and leaned my forehead against the cold steel, waiting for the adrenaline shakes to subside. I walked back to the ECR. When I opened the door, the air was clearer. The stove was drawing properly again, the flame roaring with a healthy, aggressive sound. The smoke was dissipating through the vent side cracked open.
Sarah was awake. She was sitting up, clutching the duct tape patch on her side. She looked at me, at the snow on my shoulders, at the wild look in my eyes. "You look like hell," she whispered. "Fix the stove," I said, stripping off my outer layer. I checked the thermometer, 40 degrees and rising. I sat down on the floor, pulling my knees to my chest. The fight had taken something out of me. It was not just the physical effort. It was the realization of the breach. "They can climb," I said quietly. "The roof is not safe." Sarah stared at the fire. "How many?" "One. A fast one. It came down the pendant lines." I looked at the server racks, at the dark corners of the room. This metal box was a fortress, but a fortress is just a prison with better walls. "We need a watch rotation," I said, "and we need weapons better than a broken drill." I stood up and went to the tool chest. I pulled out a spud wrench, a massive ironworker's tool. It was 2 feet long, solid steel, with a tapered spike on one end for aligning bolt holes and a heavy wrench jaw on the other. I handed it to her. "If something opens that door and it is not me," I said, "swing for the head. Do not stop swinging until it stops moving." She took the wrench. It was heavy in her hands. She looked at it, then up at me. "Orson," she said. It was the first time she'd used my name without a prompt. "Yeah. Thank you." I did not know how to answer that. Gratitude felt like a currency from a defunct economy. "Drink your water," I said. "We have work to do when the storm breaks." I sat back down and watched the oil drip. 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 Outside, the wind battered the dragline, shaking the 4,000-ton beast. But inside, the fire held. The light held. We were alive. But as I watched the shadows dance on the wall, I could not stop thinking about the roof. The one I killed had been wearing a windbreaker. It had been a person, maybe a hiker or a worker just days ago. And it had found a way up. The industrial island was shrinking. The ocean was rising. I closed my eyes, but I kept my hand on the handle of my own spud wrench. The crisis was not over. It had just changed shifts. Time is no longer measured in hours or shifts. It is measured in voltage and calories. It has been 42 days since the grid died. I know this not because I am marking days on the wall like a prisoner in a cartoon, but because the solar almanac on the GPS and the operator's cab, which I power up for 30 seconds once a week, tells me the date is December 14th. The Wyoming winter has settled in with the weight of a tectonic plate. The wind does not stop. It screams across the Powder River Basin at 40 miles per hour, 24 hours a day, stripping the heat off the steel skin of Unit 4 faster than my stove can generate it. I woke up to the sound of the spinner. It's a low-frequency vibration, a wub 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 that resonates through the ceiling of the electrical control room. I rolled off my sleeping mat, now upgraded with 3 layers of cardboard and a quilted moving blanket scavenged from the rigger's locker, and checked the multimeter mounted on the wall. 13.4 volts. A tightness in my chest that I had not realized I was holding relaxed. We were positive. The batteries were charging. "Green light," I whispered. From the other side of the server rack, Sarah stirred. Her breathing was deeper now, the hitch of the broken ribs mostly gone. She sat up, her hair matted under a thick wool beanie, and rubbed her face with hands that were permanently stained with soot. "Temp?" she asked. Her voice was raspy, the morning voice of someone who breathes recycled, smoky air. 52, I said, checking the dial. Luxurious. This was the stasis. The panic of the first week, the adrenaline of the roof fight, the terror of the first breach, that was all gone. It had been replaced by a crushing, methodical routine. We were no longer survivors. We were components in a closed-loop system. I stood up and walked to the stove. The Mark IV was a significant evolution from the solvent can I'd built on day 2. It was now a dual-chamber design, welded from 2 sections of 6-inch heavy wall pipe I'd cut from a discarded handrail. The bottom chamber vaporized the oil. The top chamber acted as a heat exchanger radiator before venting exhaust. I adjusted the needle valve. The flame inside the viewport was a steady blue-orange cone. We were burning a mix of hydraulic fluid and diesel now. I'd siphoned the fuel tank of the auxiliary generator to cut the viscosity of the heavy gear oil. It burned cleaner, less soot to scrub from the flue every 3 days. "Your turn for the bucket," Sarah said, pulling her boots on. "I know." The bucket was the only part of the routine that never got easier. Sanitation on a steel island is a logistical nightmare. You can't just go outside. The wind chill is 30 below zero, and opening the door dumps precious heat. And you can't let waste accumulate inside. I picked up the 5-gallon pail with the snap-on lid, heavy with the last 24 hours of biological reality. I walked to the airlock we'd built. We could not afford to open the main door directly to the outside anymore, so we had constructed a vestibule using plastic sheeting and a wooden pallet frame inside the machinery house doorway. I stepped into the vestibule, sealed the inner flap, and then unbolted the heavy steel outer door. The cold hit me like a hammer. It wasn't just air. It was a physical presence that tried to instantly freeze the moisture in my nostrils. I stepped onto the catwalk. The world was white and gray. The pit below was a blurred landscape of snowdrifts and dark, jagged shapes. I walked to the designated dump zone, the leeward side of the counterweight, away from our air intakes. I poured the contents of the bucket over the rail. The wind caught the liquid instantly, turning it into a fine mist of ice before it even hit the ground 200 feet below. I looked down. They were still there. The herd had thinned, but the diehards remained. Dark specks in the snow, standing motionless or drifting slowly with the wind. They did not look up anymore. They had learned that the yellow mountain was inedible. But they waited. They were a patient siege engine made of frozen meat. I retreated inside, locking the door and waiting in the vestibule for my shivering to subside before re-entering the warm zone of the house. Back in the ECR, Sarah was already working on breakfast. Cooking was a generous term. We were eating a slurry of crushed crackers and warm water, flavored with a packet of hot cocoa mix. "The spinner sounds rough," she said, handing me a tin cup. "Bearing? Probably. It was not designed for that kind of thrust load." The spinner was my masterpiece. We could not run the generator, no fuel to spare. The solar panels on the roof were covered in snow and ice that was too dangerous to clear daily. So,
I had turned to the wind. I had scavenged a blower motor from the HVAC unit of the operator's cab.
It was a heavy-duty, permanent magnet DC motor.
I'd mounted it to a steel plate and bolted it to the roof railing. For blades, I used 3 shovel heads I'd cut from plastic snow shovels found in the maintenance shed, bolted to a hub made from a pulley wheel. It was ugly. It looked like something from a junkyard war. But when the wind hit those shovel blades, it spun the motor, turning it into a generator. It pushed about 3 amps into our battery bank, enough to run the LED lights, charge the radio, and keep the lantern batteries topped off. "I'll grease it today," I said, drinking the sludge. "We need to check the water catch too. The heat tape might be failing." The water system was the other half of the equation. We had blocked the downspouts of the machinery house gutters, diverting the meltwater through a PVC pipe that ran through the wall and into a 55-gallon drum inside the house. To keep the pipe from freezing, I had stripped the copper windings from a transformer and wrapped the pipe in a tight coil, running a low current through it from the battery bank. Resistance heating. It was inefficient, but it kept the water flowing. "I'll check the catch," Sarah said. "My ribs are fine. I need to move." "Take the spud wrench," I said automatically. "I always do." We finished the meal in silence. The conversation had run dry weeks ago. We knew each other's life stories, our regrets, our childhood pets.
Now, communication was purely functional. Status, resource, threat. I stood up to begin the morning maintenance. My job today was the long walk. We had exhausted the easy scavenge, the lockers, the break room, the cab. To survive until spring, we needed to go deeper. I needed to access the revolving frame's belly, the deep storage compartments where the heavy spare parts were kept. I put on my tool belt. It was lighter now. I carried only what I used: a multi-tool, a flashlight, the heavy pipe wrench, and a pry bar. "Radio check," I said. Sarah tapped the Motorola handset clipped to her chest. "Check. Channel 1. I left the ECR and stepped into the gloom of the machinery house. The air here was 10 degrees, just warm enough to keep the oil in the drums liquid. I walked toward the rear of the machine, past the massive hoist drums. The steel cables were wound tight, holding the bucket in suspension just off the ground. I reached the hatch for the lower deck. This was the dungeon. The revolving frame was a labyrinth of girders and compartments beneath the main machinery. I descended the ladder. The darkness was absolute. My flashlight beam cut a narrow cone through the dusty air. The silence down here was different. It was the silence of a cave. I was looking for the filter storage. In the schematics of a 90-20, there is often a designated bay for spare hydraulic filters and, crucially, rags. We were running low on rags. And rags were fuel. I navigated through the narrow crawl space between the swing pinions. The grease here was old and tacky, pulling at my boots. I found the compartment. It was a heavy steel door, latched tight. I jammed the pry bar into the handle and heaved. The latch groaned, rusted shut by years of neglect. I put my boot against the wall and pushed. Bang! The door flew open. I shined the light inside. Jackpot. Boxes of pig mat, oil-absorbent pads, bales of cotton rags, and, in the back, a plastic crate that did not belong to the machine. I pulled the crate out. It was a personal stash. Mechanics have been hiding things in drag lines for 50 years. I popped the lid. Inside, a stack of Maxim magazines from 2012, a bottle of Jim Beam, frozen slush, a carton of Marlboro Reds, and 3 cans of Dinty Moore beef stew. I stared at the stew cans. The labels were faded, but the metal was not bulging. Protein. Real, chemically preserved, sodium-rich protein.
I put the cans in my pockets, treating them with more reverence than I would a bar of gold. Then I heard it. Scritch, scritch. It was coming from the ventilation trunking above my head. The 90-20 has massive air intakes to cool the motors. The ductwork is large enough for a man to crawl through. We had graded the main intakes, but the internal routing was a maze. I froze, killing my light. In the dark, the sound was amplified. Claws on sheet metal. Scritch, thud. Something was in the ducts. I reached for my radio, pressing the transmit button without speaking. Click, click. The signal for hold position. I backed away slowly, moving toward the ladder. The noise stopped. Then, a low, inquisitive, chattering sound echoed from the vent above the filter locker. It did not sound human. It sounded like a raccoon, but heavier. I turned my light back on, aiming it at the vent grate. 2 eyes reflected the beam. Not the milky white of the infected. These were green. A badger. A massive American badger had found its way into the intake, seeking warmth. I lowered the pry bar. A badger was not a zombie, but in a confined space, it was a chainsaw with fur. "Get out," I whispered. The badger hissed, baring teeth that could snap a finger off like a carrot. I backed away. I was not going to fight a badger for a bale of rags. I grabbed 2 packs of the absorbent pads and the personal stash crate and retreated. When I climbed back up to the main deck, I was sweating despite the cold. I walked back to the ECR. Sarah was waiting at the door, the spud wrench in her hand. "Signal?" she asked. "False alarm. Wildlife," I said, dumping the loot on the floor. "Badger in the intake." "Meat?" she asked. The question was purely practical. "Too dangerous. Those things do not die easy, and I did not want to risk a bite infection." I pulled the Jim Beam and the beef stew out of the crate.
Sarah's eyes went wide. The sight of the cans broke the stoic mask for a second. A genuine, human hunger washed over her face. "Beef stew," she whispered. "And whiskey," I added. Though the alcohol content is probably the only thing keeping us sane, so we rationed that too. We did not celebrate. Celebration implies victory. This was just a reprieve. I opened 1 can with my multi-tool. We split it cold, sitting on the floor near the stove. The taste was overwhelming, salty, fatty, metallic. It was the best meal I had ever eaten. "The badger means there's a hole," Sarah said, scraping the bottom of the can. "If a badger can get in, a rat can get in. If a rat can get in, the smell gets out." "I know," I said. "I'll weld a plate over the secondary intake tomorrow. I can run the welder off the battery bank for maybe 30 seconds before the voltage sags too low." 30 seconds is enough for a tack weld, she said. She was learning. 6 weeks ago, she did not know a welding rod from a spark plug. Now, she understood the amp hours of a lead-acid battery. After the meal, I went to the window. We had cleared a small section of the dust gap louvers so we could use the binoculars. I set up the spotting scope on a tripod. It was my turn to watch. I scanned the horizon. The world was dead quiet. The wind turbines on the ridge were motionless, their blades locked in feather position. The highway, 5 miles away, was a ribbon of white snow dotted with the dark shapes of abandoned cars. But through the scope, I saw something new. About 10 miles south, where the rail line cut through the hills, there was a column of smoke. It was not the black, oily smoke of a tire fire or a burning structure. It was thin, gray, and rhythmic. Wood smoke. Someone else had survived. I watched it for an hour. It was steady,
A deliberate signal? Or just a chimney? "Sarah," I said. She came to the scope. I stepped aside. She looked for a long time. "It's the switching station," she said. "The old brick building near the junction." "People," I said. "Or a trap," she countered. "Or competition." We looked at each other. The isolation of the drag line had been our safety. We were invisible, unreachable, and uninteresting to the dead. But the living? The living were variable. The living had needs. If they saw the steam from our vent or the glint of our spinner— "We go dark tonight," I said. "Blackout shutters on the ECR vents, no light leaks." We watched them for 3 days. If the smoke stops, they moved on or died. If it stays, then we decide if we're neighbors or enemies. I turned away from the window and looked at our small, steel world. The hum of the heater fan, the drip of the oil stove, the drip of the melting snow. It was fragile. A single failed bearing, a single clogged pipe, a single infected climber, and this ecosystem would collapse. I walked to the wall and picked up a piece of soapstone. I wrote on the steel bulkhead, under the date. December 14th. Smoke spotted south. Badger in intake. Stew good. I looked at my hands. The grease was etched into the fingerprint so deep I doubted it would ever come out. I was not a mechanic fixing a machine anymore. I was the machine's antibody, keeping the infection out, keeping the fluids moving. "Orson," Sarah said, her voice soft. "Yeah." The spinner stopped. I froze. The background vibration, the wub, 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 was gone. "Ice," I said, grabbing my tool belt. "The blade's iced up." "I'll get the safety harness," she said, already moving to the locker. "No," I said, "I'll do it. You man the stove. Keep the pressure up." I walked to the door. The dread was not there anymore. The fear of the cold, the height, the dead things below, it had been ground down into a dull acceptance. This was the job. I opened the door to the howling white void. The wind screamed, trying to push me off the ledge. I clipped my lanyard to the rail and stepped out. "Copy that," I whispered to no one. "Going to work." I climbed the icy railing to the roof, my scraper in hand, ready to fight the ice for another amp-hour of life. This was the stasis, and we would hold it until the steel rusted to dust.